Good morning and welcome to Wakayama University Center for Tourism Research Seminar, Building Rural Tourism Resilience, Benchmarking Approaches from Japan and Australia. We thank you for your attendance today, for those in the room and those in Zoom. We are very excited to present to you a full day of seminars and research by some of the leading researchers in Australia and Japan on the topic of rural tourism. But firstly, before we start the proceedings, some opening remarks from Director of the Center for Tourism Research and Vice President of Wakayama University, Dr. Hiroshima Adachi.
Dear distinguished colleagues, I extend to you warm greetings from Wakayama University. I'm Motohiro Adachi, Vice President, Wakayama University, and Director for Center for Tourism Research, CTR. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this international symposium. It's been wonderful to see the research work presented by members and visiting fellows of the CTR. You deserve big congratulations. I would also like to acknowledge the CTR team also who have worked hard to ensure the things run smoothly. Especially Professor Joseph Chier. He has been working really hard, not only for this symposium, but CTR, since the first day he joined us. His contribution to CTR and to the university is tremendous. I would like to take this opportunity to convey my great gratitude. Thank you, Joseph. Before the symposium starts, I would like to talk briefly about the CTR and its overall aims. CTR was established in 2016 with a mission to contribute to the development of a sound and sustainable society through internationalization and advancement of tourism research. Since the establishment of CTR, we have been actively conducting research activities and projects in tourism in collaboration with industry, government bodies, and communities, and host numerous events, including international symposiums. It's exciting for us to host an event like this, as we help participate in the sharing of new knowledge. Again, I extend a warm welcome and thank you sincerely for taking the time to attend this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Motohiro Adachi, Director of the Center for Tourism Research here at Wakayama University. The next person who will make some brief remarks introducing the center and the symposium is Kazue Nakamoto, the Head of International Engagement here at Wakayama University, as well as the Principal Officer of the Center for Tourism Research. I hand over to Kazue Nakamoto.
Thank you very much, Joseph Sensei. 皆さんおはようございます。中本です。Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Kazue Nakamoto. I'm the Head of International Engagement and the Principal Officer at the Institute for Global Initiatives at Wakayama University. Welcome you all to this exciting international symposium. We are honored to host this event with the theme of Building Rural Tourism Resilience, Benchmarking Approaches from Japan and Australia. The symposium is funded by Australia-Japan Foundation and Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and is part of a larger project to understand how rural tourism can be positioned for more beneficial local level outcomes. We extend our great thanks to Australia-Japan Foundation. Today, we are extremely lucky to have some of the most prominent and leading scholars from Australia and Japan for this event. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Anne Hardy, Dr. Carolin Funck, and Dr. Eiji Ito, Dr. Kia Reeves, and Dr. Michael Volga, Dr. Susanne Klien, and Dr. Tamara Yang, and lastly, Dr. Joseph Chier, Center for Tourism Research, Wakayama University. And now I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Chier, who joined us in 2019. As Professor Adachi mentioned, he has been working really hard from the day one he joined us, and his achievement is truly remarkable. He has published 8 books and numerous journal articles, hosted quite a few symposiums and seminars, and delivered keynote speeches all around the world, like Harvard University and the University of Surrey. Wakayama University is presently ranked in top 150 and 200 for tourism research and studies in the world. We are the only university in Japan achieving this status, which we are very proud of. And this is thanks to Dr. Chia and CTR team's tremendous contribution. And thank you very much, Dr. Chia and the team. And also, thanks to our university distinguished professors, Dr. Brent Ritchie, Dr. Graham Miller, and Dr. Richard Shapley. They have been providing great support to Center for Tourism Research since the establishment of the center. I'd like to take this opportunity to deliver special thanks to them as well. As just mentioned before, the Institute for Global Initiatives was launched just this year with the aim of enhancement of globalization at Wakayama University. Institute for Global Initiatives is made up of 2 key centers, Center for Tourism Research and Center for Japanology Studies. Center for Tourism Research was formed in 2015, and its purpose is to enhance and advance educational and research activities in tourism and play a pivotal role as a hub for tourism studies and research in Japan, as well as the wider Asia Pacific region. The Center for Tourism Research is also aligned to and lead the Faculty of Tourism, where tourism education takes place. Whereas the Center for Tourism Japanology was launched just this year, and its mission is to create the community beyond borders and nationalities through Japanese language and cultural studies. The center is determined to enhance student-faculty mobility through Japanese language and cultural studies, and building global understanding and goodwill through culture and language exchange. Through this initiative, I expect students will understand and appreciate their own culture and respect others. It will also make them realize how important their own culture is, and will lead to conserving their own and other culture. Travel and culture exchange are the best educators, and our intention to link Japanology studies to tourism studies can have enormous benefit for the tourism sector. I believe that dual initiatives, Center for Tourism Research and Center for Japanology Studies, address a critical need for the Japan tourism industry for the future. That is, developing greater cultural intelligence in the tourism workforce of the future. All over the globe, it is clear that for the tourism industry to make a full recovery, it needs to address workforce shortages. Without a well-trained, highly motivated workforce, tourism recovery will be very constrained. International tourists have become accustomed to the particularly high standard evident in the Japanese tourism industry. Now, how this is maintained is very critical and important. And I think that building greater cultural intelligence in the tourism workforce will be vital. At the same time, the Japanese tourism industry must explore how to attract tourism workers from abroad as a way of addressing the shortfall of tourism sector employees. And as the industry recovers after the pandemic. I believe that building greater cultural intelligence will be the key to enabling the Japanese tourism industry to address its labor force shortage through attracting foreign tourism professionals trained in Japan and truly concerned with Japanese language and culture and way of life. Since the pandemic started, student and faculty mobility has been very limited, and most international and cross-cultural engagement has taken place just online. However, I feel that internationalization works best when people can experience people and their own their culture firsthand. A good understanding of the culture will help assist tourism sector's recovery. Therefore, I welcome international joint and collaboration activities like this symposium. So welcome again and enjoy this exciting event. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Kazuo and Nakamoto. Kazuo is really one of the driving forces of the Center for Tourism Research. So we thank you for your participation in this today, Kazuo-san. So my purpose today, and over the next 10 or so minutes, is to introduce our participants, is to also talk about the background to this study and what we hope to achieve from the wider project. I also want to thank Maki Kobayashi, the coordinator at the Center for Tourism Research, who has been responsible for all of the logistics regarding this event. So let me just draw on some of my slides right now, and give me 1 second. As alluded to in the promotional material and on my cover slide, this symposium is titled Building Rural Tourism Resilience, Benchmarking Approaches from Japan and Australia. We acknowledge the Australia-Japan Foundation, which is an office of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, for their support in this as part of Australia's bilateral relationship with Japan. So participants in this project are leading researchers in tourism and wider multidisciplinary areas from Japan and Australia. Our first speaker this morning will be Professor Carolin Funck, as you can see on the program there. Carolin is from Hiroshima University and is arguably the leading tourism geographer in Japan and has an extensive resume of examining the rural context here in Japan. Hiroshima University is also one of the leading universities in Japan with a track record of peace and global studies, as well as tourism and geographies. Carolin's work mostly focuses on sustainable tourism from the viewpoint of geography, and she's especially interested in forms of new tourism on islands, like ecotourism, art tourism, and marine tourism, and how it affects the social and natural environment of destinations. So welcome, Carolin. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Professor Kia Reeves. Kia is a professor of history and heritage at Federation University in Australia and co-director of the Future Regions Research Centre. His research sits at the intersection of history, heritage, cultural tourism, and regional studies, emphasizing the multidisciplinary nature of tourism research. Kia is Vice President and Director of AusHeritage, a network of Australian cultural heritage management organisations established by the Australian government in 1996, and the network aims to facilitate the engagement of practitioners and organisations for the Australian heritage industry in the overseas arena. Welcome, Kia, to Wakayama as well. I also welcome Associate Professor Anne Hardy. Anne is Associate Professor of Tourism and Society, School of Social Sciences, University of Tasmania. She's also Associate Head of Research, School of Social Sciences, and co-director of the Tourism Research and Education Network. Anne is best known for her work on Tourism Tracer, one of the first researchers to apply a technology-based approach to tracking tourism movements in destinations. Her most recent book is Tracking Tourists, Movement and Mobility, the first book of its type in the world to address tourist movement from a methodological angle in the post-digital era. So welcome, Anne. I also pay tribute to Associate Professor Susanne Klien. Susanne has spoken at the Center for Tourism Research a couple of times already. Susanne is Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Studies at Hokkaido University. So as you can see, Susanne's work is not necessarily first and foremost about tourism, but tourism is a big part of her ongoing work. She's the author of Rethinking Japan's Identity and International Role, Tradition and Change in Japan's Foreign Policy. Susanne's research is mainly qualitative and focuses on modern and contemporary Japan. She has previously investigated the practice and transmission of traditions in rural Japan, such as local festivals, meanings of life, regional revitalization, tourism, as well as alternative lifestyles in rural Japan. She's presently working on a very interesting ethnographic project examining transnational mobility of Japanese individuals in Europe. Welcome, Susanne. I also acknowledge Associate Professor Michael Volga. Michael is Associate Professor with the School of Management and Marketing, Curtin Business School at Curtin University, and co-director of the Curtin Tourism Research Cluster. Michael has traveled the longest way because he's in Western Australia, which is on the other side of the continent. Michael holds a degree in Economics and Business Administration from Catholic University of Ingolstadt in Germany. Pardon my pronunciations. His main areas of expertise include product development, innovation in tourism, tourism destination governments, and destination management, as well as sustainable consumer behavior. Michael established Australia's Southwest Tourism Observatory and is currently leading a special issue in the Journal of Sustainable Tourism on evidence-based planning in tourism. Michael is also one of the leading experts on the establishment of UNWTO's International Sustainable Tourism Observatories. And we hope that one day Michael can help us set one up here in Wakayama. I also welcome Professor Eiji Ito, an old friend of the Center for Tourism Research. Eiji is former director at the Center for Tourism Research at Wakayama University up until March 2021. Eiji is one of Japan's leading leisure studies researchers and is an associate professor in the School of Health and Sports Science at Chukyo University, Japan. He was awarded his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science at Juntendo University here in Japan and earned his PhD at the University of Alberta in Canada. His areas of research include sport, tourism, leisure studies, and cultural psychology, what he will talk about today. Eiji is Senior Associate Editor of the leading Journal of Leisure Research, the Journal of Leisure Research, it's called. It is an international scholarly journal that publishes innovative and interdisciplinary research that addresses critical issues of access to and engagement in leisure behaviors as they affect health and well-being. Welcome back to your second home, Eiji. Finally, I acknowledge Associate Professor Tamara Young, who's joining us via Zoom, who couldn't be with us in person today. Tamara is an Associate Professor in the Newcastle Business School, College of Human and Social Futures. Her research is in the multidisciplinary field of tourism studies with an emphasis on critical tourism theory and cultural research methodologies. Her research is focused on the role of tourism media as an interface between traveler cultures and traveled cultures, the social and cultural aspects of travel and tourism, especially youth tourism, their representation and interpretation of Aboriginal Australia in tourism and Indigenous tourism, cultural landscapes, and culturally sustainable tourism in Australia. So they are our speakers, and I welcome all of them, and I look forward to hearing of their work to come. So just a brief background on what the Australia-Japan Foundation is. As our major supporter, the Australia-Japan Foundation is Australia's oldest cultural council, supporting people-to-people links between Japan and Australia, underpinning the key bilateral and regional relationship as two of the key countries in the Asia Pacific. It was established in 1976 by the Australian government to achieve three aims: to increase awareness and understanding in Japan of shared interests with Australia, to increase awareness and understanding in Australia of the importance of Japan to Australia as an economic and strategic partner. And of course, Japan has been a major economic partner of Australia over the last 4 or 5 decades. And in fact, in many ports, you will see Australian coal and other things helping this bilateral relationship. And the third thing the Australia-Japan Foundation does is to increase recognition in Japan of Australian excellence and expertise. Hence, we have our speakers here today. So the Australia-Japan Partnership strives to achieve 4 things, or strives to do the 4 things: to reinforce that it is Australia's closest and most mature partner in Asia, that it enjoys a high degree of complementarity. We have a lot in common, and is crucial to each other's strategic and economic interests. It is built on common values and interests, including shared commitment to democracy, freedom, the rule of law, and human rights. And it is a true friendship at the government, business, community, school, and individual levels, as we can see from this. So with that, some brief comments about this project itself, to help those who will be listening in to understand what we are trying to achieve here. Obviously, the pandemic has loomed large on all of our horizons. And while the pandemic has been catastrophic for international and domestic tourism, it has also turned the gaze onto rural areas where space is usually in abundance, and where the effects of the pandemic were seen to be much more limited in the rural areas. The attraction of rurality has been given a new lease on life, as well as attracting domestic visitors seeking to escape the crowded urban centers. However, this renewed attention on the rural periphery raises myriad concerns, especially the extent to which rural communities can absorb greater numbers of tourists and change that comes with it, and whether in the midst of all of this, the threats to their way of life might not be worth the impost. And our first speaker, Professor Carolin Funck, will talk about this. You know, the spectrum between revitalization and gentrification is quite an important one. Tourism is at the vanguard of this movement towards the rural areas, but unless communities at the rural periphery are part of this expansion, their capacity to ensure that development prioritizes their interests will be really limited. Moreover, the social and ecological assets of communities at the rural periphery is what is prized. Yet, to what extent will tourism undermine all of this? Here at the Center for Tourism Research, we are based in Wakayama Prefecture, which is an hour from Osaka, more or less a regional and rural area. We are committed to building a renewed focus on understanding how rural communities in the prefecture will approach recovery and resilience building. So the main outcome from this project, apart from today's webinar, is a long-term focus on the development of rural tourism and how it can be managed going forward. The Wakayama Prefecture is an exemplar or an example of what we will talk about here today. And we see our speakers coming from a number of states in Australia: Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales, and Western Australia. And that gives us a very good, diverse look at this situation. So the initiatives from this project will include this symposium, as well as a special issue in the journal Rural Society, a specialist journal in rural studies, and then hopefully over the long term, a number of activities. So after the first three speakers focusing on Japan, we will have a break, and then we'll have the next three speakers focusing on Australia. With that said, I welcome you all online and in the room. We have a nice small audience here, and I will start the proceedings of the day, beginning with our first speaker, Professor Carolin Funck from Hiroshima University. Welcome, Carolin. I hand over the floor to you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you for the invitation. After a long kind of dearth in international conferences and meetings, I'm very excited. Actually, the last international conference I was at was also in Wakayama in 2020 when COVID was approaching. We had the Asia Critical Tourism Conference here. So before and hopefully after Corona, it's meeting at Wakayama. So I'm very glad about this opportunity. Thank you for the invitation. So I will talk about the effects of rural tourism development in Japan, resilience, sustainability, or gentrification. And as I put a question mark, you see this is still work in process. And I understand our symposium very much as a place to exchange ideas, because we don't really know where the changes are going to that are happening right now. So Corona has changed the way we travel, or maybe not. And we have a lot of changes through the digitalization. So I will try to discuss some ideas, but I will probably not be able to suggest a new system of benchmarking for rural tourism, but look at some of the concepts that might help us in this process. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I would like to give a little bit of information about the background in Japan, because many of our participants are here for the first time, maybe. And I think we also have a lot of participants online from abroad. So to give you some background about the situation in Japan, before talking about lodging facilities or accommodation facilities as one example of how rural revitalization and gentrification happen in Japan, especially before and especially during and after COVID. So my first background is about resilience, sustainability, and gentrification. And you are all very familiar with the concepts of sustainability and resilience, so I don't have to introduce them, I think. My source for this comparison is from Alan Liu's paper, and it really shows very well, I think, that basically it's not that we had the concept of sustainability, now it's out of fashion, now we go to resilience. I think this comparison shows very clearly that these are two different concepts and that they should probably be integrated or used together to evaluate tourism. So especially if we look at the methods, we can see that sustainability has a stronger set of, well, it has a situation that is supposed to be ideal or close to ideal, and we measure the management and we check the management and see how close we get to the situation. Whereas resilience, as you all know, has more emphasis on flexibility. It does not address the causes of the social and environmental change, but it tries to create flexibility within society. So while these concepts are different, I think putting them together and using part of them together would help us to create a new system or a new type of evaluation for rural tourism. I can't see my screen here, it's too small. Well, the more complicated thing is gentrification. We all know gentrification is something really bad. It happens in urban areas. It means the original population is evicted, buildings are renovated or even reconstructed, and a new type of population moves in. Well, it's not that simple. So in the paper from Ikeda, she cites a German concept of gentrification. And I'm sorry, I have to move here to see it. So it has the structural upgrading, social upgrading, functional upgrading, and symbolic upgrading as different aspects of gentrification. And especially the social upgrading, sorry, the screen is too small. We have the change of the social structure, but we also have like cultural facilities or high-end gastronomy, high-end retailing, emerging of new uses, and a kind of new image for the area. And this is actually exactly what we aim for when we develop tourism. So when we think about this, gentrification is probably what many areas, especially rural areas, try to achieve when they start tourism development. So then maybe gentrification is not only bad. We have to see it in a more differentiated way. So one of my students started researching tourism gentrification in rural areas in Japan, and she got so confused with the concept and then she had to give up on this idea of using it, because she said, okay, it's originally supposed to be a negative process. And it becomes even more complicated in Japan, because if you think of replacing population, original population, as something negative, but what happens if the population is disappearing anyway? So we need to replace this because we replace it, or of course we can give those areas back to nature, which is another possibility. So if we have, like in Japan, a loss of population and aging and the decline of existing uses, then new uses and new groups of populations coming in would be something positive. It could be the kind of what's recently a popular phrase, creative destruction, to create something new of the old things. And so we need different indicators for rural gentrification. Well, the negative aspects of tourism gentrification were the buying up of old traditional houses and changing them to tourist facilities has influenced local rents and really has a negative aspect, affected local residents, has been reported in Japan before COVID in Kyoto and Kanazawa and Osaka, but these are not rural areas. These are urban areas. However, we should not forget the central question of gentrification, which is basically land ownership and ownership of buildings. So this is a quote from 1987 from one of the first critics of mass tourism, Krippendorf, pointing out that really selling the resources for the new use means losing power of deciding what's happening in the tourism development. So we could find positive aspects in gentrification, and that's why I want to combine it with resilience and sustainability, but we can also use it as an indicator for this kind of negative aspect of losing control, losing land, and losing ownership of facilities. So this is the background. For the research questions that I want to discuss is what is the role of lodging facilities in tourism development? And can we combine the three concepts of sustainability, resilience, and gentrification to evaluate the role of the lodging facilities? Lodging facilities always have played a very important role in tourism development in rural areas, because unless you have lodging facilities, people won't stay. Unless people stay overnight, they won't drop money. It's a very simple system. And also, if we look at the traditional, for example, hot spring resorts in Japan, usually there's one big main lodging facility, and the owners of that facility used to control the whole area. So the lodging facilities play an important role in the power structure of the destinations as well. I have drawn from different research projects that I am running and that my students are running, and most of these are still ongoing. I have been participating in seminars by the Setouchi DMO held by owners of lodging facilities, talking about their experience. We have interviewed the owners of camping, glamping facilities, and facilities reusing vacant buildings. And I will introduce a case study of Setoda. So I have participated in the workshops conducted there and interviewing the people who are involved in the development process. But the focus is mainly on the people who are kind of running the facilities, or also partly the tourists, and not so much on the people of the wider community. So this is an aspect that is not sufficiently covered in this research. So the second background I need to introduce is vacant buildings. So why do we need vacant buildings in this discussion? Because a lot of lodging facilities nowadays in Japan reuse vacant buildings. And we have a lot of vacant buildings and actually vacant land also in Japan. When you travel around Wakayama the next few days, looking out of the car window, you will see lots of fields that are no longer in use, easily distinguished by the overgrowth. And you will probably see lots of houses like that in different stages, like in this village here of derelict overgrowth. The Japanese housing market has a high percentage of owned housing, and people prefer new buildings. That is one reason for the large number of vacant buildings. And the second one is the loss of population in the rural areas. I'm focusing with my research on islands, and islands especially have been losing population. Many villages on the smaller islands, over 50% of residents are above the age of 65. So the vacant buildings increase in suburban and rural areas, especially doubled within 20 years. And all of Japan, it is said that 13.6% of residential housing is vacant. The definition of vacant for this statistic is kind of vague. It says not being inhabited for more than 3 months. But only half of these 30.6% are really constantly vacant. Others are kind of in the stage of waiting for reuse. But this means we have this large amount of empty space and empty buildings that can be reused and need to be reused, because otherwise they create a really negative image of the destination. Of course, we have a type of tourism where people like to go to derelict industrial areas or derelict areas. So some people are attracted by these landscapes of decay, but this is not the majority of tourists. And it's not kind of sustainable because, well, it's going to be decaying. In 5 years, it's gone. So how to use this kind of buildings in a way for the positive development of rural tourism is a very important task at the moment in the tourism development in Japan. Also, we have to think about the concept of adaptive reuse, meaning originally basically historic buildings that are preserved through finding new uses for them. And this has been said to have a very strong relation, especially if it is historic landmark buildings like former merchant houses or large buildings that are then used as museums or lodging facilities and so on. So the idea is that through adaptive use, meaning changing the original use of the building to something new, we can preserve the value of the building and at the same time maximize the benefits for the local communities. So in a way, adaptive reuse is a form of sustainable renewal and prolongs the building's life, which is an important aspect from sustainability. Adaptive reuse in the literature has been mainly discussed for urban context and for heritage building, and less so for the daily life buildings like residential buildings. In Japan, we have seen a very strong movement to renovate not only these landmark or historic buildings, but also residential buildings from the 1970s, when the movement to preserve historical districts became strong and was introduced by law also in 1975. So an adaptive use of vacant buildings as lodging facilities could contribute to environmental sustainability and social cohesion, especially also in rural areas. And actually in Japan, of course, the buildings are mainly, the residential traditional buildings are mainly wooden buildings. You need special technologies for the redevelopment. These techniques and technologies have really been developed in the recent 30 years or so, starting from Kyoto and spreading all over the country. Now, finally, the third background is about changes in tourism in Japan before and during COVID. These are just some of the basic data about tourism, the number of Japanese travelers in Japan, expenditure per overnight trip, the household income of Japan, and the number of international visitors. And we can see that, well, it's well known that Japan had an international tourism bubble before COVID. The goal at the moment was at, I can't remember the Japanese numbers. This is now 31 millions, right? So they want to go up to 60 millions. I don't think they will reach it, but that's a different question. But we can see that also domestic tourism was kind of picking up a little bit, but it had really gone down. It really goes in strong curves depending on the economic situation, partly. But we can see that domestic tourism was still reasonably, sorry, there's one number missing here. There's 5 numbers here too. Reasonably strong, only kind of decreased to half during COVID because our restrictions were not as strong as in many other countries. But the international visitors, there's no zero here afterwards, really decreased to almost zero because the country was locked down. So what has changed in the way people travel? We had a new type of tourism called in Japan, Japanese English microtourism. I don't think that's an international term. It means basically traveling to places close by. And it was supported by 2 things. One is we had a lot of travel restrictions within the prefecture. So you were supposed not to leave your prefecture. I don't think COVID cares so much about prefecture borders, but that was the instruction. So we all stayed within our prefecture and we could not visit the urban areas because they were dangerous. So we could go to neighboring rural areas. So that promoted rural tourism. And the travel subsidies for traveling inside Japan to restart the economy started from local or regional subsidies. So you would first get money to travel within Wakayama or within Hiroshima. So both of these things made people travel to destinations close by. That influenced also, then COVID also influenced the way where people stay. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of albergo diffuso. It means basically different houses in one town together form one hotel. So in Japan, that would mean if you have in a historic district, you have several houses like this, and you have one house that's the reception, and then you rent like one of the other houses as a hotel room. So it's the whole town as one hotel. And there's one chain in Japan, which is a quite high grade, which has developed this kind of albergo diffuso in many of the historic districts. So that gives you the chance to be alone with the people you travel. You don't have to meet other tourists. So it's a safe way of staying. Another important new trend was glamping. I will explain about that later. Then outdoor leisure is not that popular in Japan as it is in Western societies, but the COVID brought us a boom in outdoor. Petit outdoor means using your camping cooker to make coffee on your veranda, actually. So it means like doing outdoor activities in your daily life surroundings. But we also have more solo camping, guided trekking, and things like that. And then we have the workation, so where people stay in a place outside of the area where they usually live and work from there online. All these were strongly influenced by media. If you switch on the TV every night, you will see a program about glamping. Every night, really. And this is also, of course, influenced by the goods and facility producers of these tents and the furniture, what's in there, and the stoves and all these goods. So now let me turn to the examples. The first one is glamping. I don't know about Australia. You've probably had it for a long time. In Japan, it became popular since 2015. And by 2020, we were supposed to be about 354 sites. It's hard to count because very often you have facilities like this one here, where you have one glamping tent, but the rest was actually normal campsite. So how do you count the facilities? Really, it's not so easy. The development of glamping facility was actually supported by government funds for the restructuring of businesses. So many companies use that to get into the leisure market. And sometimes it's part of an existing hotel. This one is actually on the rooftop of a hotel. There's one tent and one glamping facility, or upgrading of campsites, or new developments like this one here. So this was an empty lot and they built this glamping facility. And there's a large variety of software, meaning like offers of experiences of food and things, and the hardware combinations, what kind of tents, how high luxury, and so on. And of course, some are in very beautiful natural settings like this one on the Rabbit Island. Some are more emphasis on privacy. So you will sit within a fence, which is not so clear if it's so attractive to me, but so if we look at glamping from the three aspects of sustainability, resilience, and gentrification, what could be considered? First of all, glamping is a kind of outdoor for beginners. From what we researched with the tourists, people go there, they have not been camping before. They want to try out nature, but they want to be in a safe environment. So it might be a chance to create interest in nature, which is good for sustainability. And many of the glamping facilities make use of the local food products. For example, they use gibier like boar and deer and so on for barbecue. So that also connects to sustainability. However, and especially glamping has heavy environmental issues that are not discussed at all, at least in Japan. You are heating a tent, you're air conditioning a tent. You need air conditioning in summer if you want to stay in a tent. So they use huge amount of energy to keep the tents white. You have to clean them quite intensively. And because they sit in rural areas outside of villages, the sewage is also a problem. And we have now a tendency to oversupply. There are so many glamping facilities. It's clear some of them will go bankrupt. What will happen with the tents? What will happen with all the things they put in there? It's a kind of loss of material. For resilience, they do offer accommodation in areas which don't have many other facilities. Recently, almost all the islands in the Seto Inland Sea have their glamping facility. That really started in the last 2 years. But before, there was very little accommodation available. So it brings new tourists. And it creates demand for different leisure activities. So the people who come there maybe want to do some cycling, or they want to do some guided trekking or so. However, they are very difficult to operate because they sell luxury, so they have to be luxury. It's not easy to be luxury in Japanese countryside. There are insects, as I said, there is the heat, there are snakes, there are centipedes, whatsoever. So you need a lot of effort and a lot of people to keep this luxury level. And because they are kind of expensive, the visitors tend to stay within the facility, not going to other places. So they make use of vacant lots, which would be positive, and they do give an image upgrade, but they also create, of course, exclusive spaces. So that could be spaces that are no longer accessible for other people, which might be a problem. Okay, sorry. So the second example is the adaptive reuse of vacant buildings for lodging facilities. And there is such a variety of these that I cannot really introduce them all. They happened in small towns, of course, also in the big urban centers, in rural areas. It could be something like a very really beautiful historic house and a very high level, beautiful restoration that keeps the original Japanese elements of the room, but makes it more accessible for international travelers by introducing Western furniture. It could be a very simple thing like this one is a kitchen in a really old rundown house, and it's really the absolute simple, just a few boards on the walls, and you can make coffee and it's really cheap. And when you walk along the second floor, the people on the first floor will be worried that the ceiling will break through because it's such a bad construction of the house. It could be a rural house like this one, which has been very well renovated, designed, but you can see like the large window area. This is in the mountains of Hiroshima, so it gets really cold in winter. So once again, we have the problem of heating. It could be the renovation of concrete buildings also. This is an apartment building, which is now a high-grade hotel. And the women sit here because it's an Instagram spot. There's a Japanese building behind here. And with the frame from the inside, you can take a very good Instagram picture. So this adaptive reuse of lodging facilities really covers a very wide variety of settings, of methods. So it's hard to evaluate, but that means we really need to develop a kind of framework to say, okay, this is the kind of renovation, or this is a kind of reuse that is positive. Oh no, this is something that maybe should not be encouraged. So they do help to preserve the town and the village scape. There's a famous example in Shikoku in the mountains where the old traditional thatched houses were beautifully preserved. They do make reuse of building material and of the energy that was used to build the house originally. So they are very sustainable in that way. However, once again, as with glamping, there is more emphasis on the design usually than on the environmental issues and the building quality. So there is a huge difference in the sustainability of running the building as a lodging facility. They have similar advantages in resilience, like glamping, as they create accommodation. For example, this house sits in an area in a town that really has almost no other tourist accommodation. So for the first time it brings in tourists. They create demand for food because people who stay there very often order a dinner from a local provider. And they do require traditional and new skills for renovation. So that is also an important aspect because it means they keep the skills that are used to for the old buildings, but they also introduce skills to make these buildings more livable by, for example, insulation and so on. The value of the building and the cost of renovation directly relate, of course, to the level of accommodation. So we have these places that are middle expensive. This one's very cheap, middle expensive, very expensive. We have really quite a high range of buildings and renovation, and that leads to different groups of customers and tourists coming in. One problem about these is very often they are rented out as one facility, and so there are less people involved working there, and the people who own them very often live in a different city, and they run the whole system kind of online, and they just come there when the tourists come, show them the place, and then they leave again. So it doesn't bring in so many residents, new residents probably. And finally, let me check my time. Yeah, okay. My last example is a little bit more complicated. It's a case of one town in the Seto Inland Sea, mixture of temple and theme park, actually. And this town sits along the Shimanami Kaido, which is a famous cycling area. So you might know about that from the sports tourism aspect. So it was the highway with 7 bridges was opened in 1999, but only since 2005 has it become really popular as a tourist destination because of the cycling tourism. However, many of the cyclists just go through in one day, and so they don't stay overnight. So this town of Setoda, that sits right in the middle of this route, as you can see from the red circle. And when the bridges were open, there was a 1-year tourist boom because all the travel agencies brought in the tourists to look at the bridges. And then we had a long phase of stagnation and a short uptick before going down to COVID. The town has several tourist attractions. It has an art museum, it has a beach, it has art around the island, but it didn't have any attractive lodging facilities. Since the 2000s, it has seen an increase in ruralness because the main product of agriculture, the lemon production, has been increasing because Hiroshima Prefecture has been branding lemons very well and with cyclists, but it has still been losing population and visitors or users of the port, and the shopping street, which is a common problem in Japan, has also been losing customers. And it has merged with nearby Onomichi City, which deprived it of some of the rights of decision, basically. So in 2020, a new luxury hotel was opened in the most iconic building of the town. So this building is an old merchant house, and it had been sitting empty for many years, and there was a lot of discussion about what to do with this. And finally, after a long process, it was taken over by a company that created this luxury resort. It's actually connected to Aman Resorts. So it's the first time we have an international resort company investing in the Seto Inland Sea area. Well, it's not direct, it's kind of indirect. But so we do get a change in visitor composition because the people who stay here and pay 40,000 yen per night are very different sector of people than usually come to these places. The same company built a cheaper hotel opposite, which is newly built actually, with a public baths. So they are trying to diversify the customer base. And connected to this, that a cafe with guest house was also developed. So within one concept, we have the cheaper guest house, the normal priced hotel, which is a new building, and the renovated landmark building, which is a luxury hotel. So this really changed the structure of the city or of the town. It's not city, of the town and the island. And on top of that, they started a 3-year workshop together with the local shopping street association to try to develop a new concept for the town and for the island. And this was run with companies from outside the island being invited to introduce new ideas for business with the hotel company and a regional, so-called regional trading company connected to it. The Setouchi DMO, which is the DMO for the whole Setouchi area, is also involved, but the city itself was actually just an observer. So it was quite a kind of almost private sector event. And for example, in the 3rd year, they discussed things like how to create an organization for the future development of the town, how to use the vacant buildings, because there are a lot of vacant buildings, especially along the shopping street, and how to introduce new business. And so after the workshop, the regional trading company introduced a new homepage, which gives information in vacant buildings and support for new projects. So they have a very strong emphasis on real estate. This is where the gentrification comes in again. So the idea is that because the shopping street has so many empty buildings, we need to get new businesses come in. But then how will that change the structure of that area? And the shopping street itself has already been rebranded. Maybe you can see this is the old sign and this is the new sign. It's more kind of a retro sign. And right now it's really weird because the first part of the shopping street from the harbor is the new hotels and the new cafe, and it looks really posh. And the second part is the derelict part where there are lots of empty buildings and old shops and so on. So it's quite interesting to see how this will develop. Will it lead to the complete gentrification, or will they be able to get a good mix? Because the visitors to the hotel also are emphasizing that they like this kind of old rundown place because it reminds them of the old Japan 30, 45, 50 years ago. So it's really interesting how the balance will be taken. So we have from the sustainability, the preservation of historic landmark buildings, reuse of material and energy. Once again, the problem, there's very little emphasis on environmental issues. The comprehensive town planning is a very new idea, but it's mainly concentrated on the center. So how will it spread to the other areas? So the problem is really, will the center be divided into the new space and the retro space? And is it okay to have this emphasis on investment from the outside? But the project has brought new residents. Some of them are full-time, but some of them are part-time, spending part of the time working on the island, part of the time going back to urban areas. So from these three examples, I've been trying to think of benchmarks or frameworks for lodging facilities, which are important to create new type of tourists, new spaces for tourists, and an image up for rural areas. And I think from the sustainability approach, we do need the environmental aspects. I do think that in environmental issues, we do have goals that are very clear. We do need to reduce energy use. We do need to think about climate change. We do need to think about the use of material. For example, the energy use of concrete compared to wood, just for the building material, is a very important issue. So for sustainability, to create benchmarks on environment is a very good way. On the other hand, resilience, the concept of resilience is probably more useful in the social and cultural area, because there we cannot really say this is the clear goal. We don't have such a clear goal. But we do know that we need diversification. We do know that we need the skills to renovate the old buildings, but also to run facilities in these buildings. We do need very high skilled people. So in that area, resilience, how far does if the lodging facility contributes to the diversification and new and old skills? For gentrification, we should really look at, is there a population that is kind of replaced, although they don't want to be replaced, or is it the population that is being lost is replaced, which would be positive? So that could work in both directions. We do need to check about land use and ownership. That's a very important issue. And we do have to think about space division. Do we really want to create these luxury spaces that are out of reach for not only the locals, but also for the normal tourists? Or do we want to have a better balance here? So that's all for me. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Carolin, for that very thought-provoking presentation. For those of you who are interested to see more of Carolin's work, in the chat I've placed some references to the work that Carolin has talked about. Certainly where Carolin does a lot of her work in the Setouichi area is a living laboratory for what we are talking about here. So if you haven't been to Japan yet, if you do come, certainly seek out the Setouichi area, but let's try and avoid over-tourism there as well. Our next speaker is Dr. Eiji Ito from Chukyo University. Eiji is the former director of the Center for Tourism Research and a very good friend of ours. And welcome you, Eiji, and I hand over to you.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everyone. Maybe good afternoon or good evening. And the camera is there. Okay, I see. But I always like behind the scene, like when I work for Wakayama University, so I'm just a little bit nervous. Anyway, So I'm from Chukyo University in Nagoya, and as Joseph introduced me, I worked for Wakayama University for 6 years. So today I see some familiar faces here, and actually I had several meetings in this room. So I'm very glad to be back, and thank you very much for the Center for Tourism Research team, and especially for Dr. Chair for this wonderful opportunity. And today, my presentation title is Sports and Rural Tourism Development, the Case of Wakayama. And as Funck Sensei, as with the Funck Sensei's presentation, my purpose of the presentation is to introduce sports tourism situations in Japan, and especially in Wakayama. And also, I hope we would like to, we can discuss some idea like overlap between rural tourism and sports tourism today. So first, before starting my presentation, I would like you to watch a short video about sports tourism that Japan Sports Agency made. So thank you for watching, and let's go to the next. So as the video nicely summarized, Japan Sports Agency has actively promoted sports tourism by emphasizing two types of sports tourism: outdoor sports tourism and budo tourism. And the video shows that there are many strong tourism attractions for these two types of sports tourism, and outdoor sports tourism and budo tourism. And budo means martial arts. Sometimes I start talking about budo tourism. People start wondering why I'm talking about agriculture tourism, because budo also means grapes, a type of fruits. So, but here, budo means martial arts. Okay, so martial arts tourism. So sometimes this is very confusing, but I'm going to talk about sports tourism, martial arts. And so these two, outdoor sports tourism attractions and budo tourism attraction, so these two types of sports tourism attraction are largely aligned with tourism attractions in Wakayama Prefecture, and I believe that which relates to rural tourism development in Wakayama Prefecture. So first, I'd like to start with Budou tourism, but again, I'm going to show you one more short video that also a Japan Sports Agency made. And the Japan Sports Agency create lots of good videos on YouTube. So please visit the website and then maybe you can see that's very useful for your research or teaching. So this is about Japan, Budou tourism in Japan. So what about Budou tourism in Wakayama Prefecture? So an important and unique Budou tourism attraction in Wakayama is Aikido. As some of you may know, Tanabe City is the birthplace of the founder of Aikido, Morihei Ueshiba. And Tanabe City is here. I wonder if my participants can see, but here, the yellow part, and we are around here, Wakayama City. And this is actually very close to Osaka Prefecture. And before the pandemic, tourists, most likely Aikido practitioner, visited his center located in Tanabe City, and even there are some inbound tourists living in this place. And this type of tourism can be considered a heritage tourism, which can experience history and cultural aspect of sports. In addition, Tanabe City has hosted Aikido tournament and event like International Aikido Congress in 2008. And this event attracted tourists, including Funck sensei. And Funck sensei actually provided me with these two nice pictures that she took at the event. And as you see here, the tourists are like spectators. So this type of tourism can be considered spectator-based event, sports tourism. And in addition, Tanabe City has recently opened a new facility, arena for martial arts, which is called Tanabe Shiritsu Budokan. This facility is not only for Aikido, but also this facility can be used for Judo and Kendo and like other martial arts. And more interestingly here is this facility has the Morihei Ueshiba Memorial Museum. So this is the main floor of, this is the map of the main floor. And the blue section is the museum. So if you go in the entrance and there's a museum, the left side. And this museum serves as a powerful heritage tourism attraction. So people can learn history of Aikido. And also people can see Aikido exhibit. And even people can experience Aikido basic moves with this interactive device. And this context is very similar to karate tourism development in Okinawa. Actually, Dr. Kia and Joseph and I visited Okinawa, and that's a very famous for Aikido karate tourism. Okinawa is one of the best examples of Budo tourism development in Japan because of the karate tourism. And Okinawa is the birthplace of karate, and Okinawa Prefecture, the Sports Commission Okinawa, and the Okinawa Convention and Visitors Bureau have used this very strong and defendable sports tourism brand for karate tourism development. Similarly, in Tanabe City, one tourism agency, Tabikyo Japan, recognized the similar situation, very strong and defendable sports asset in Tanabe City. And this company, collaborating with Kumano Tourism Bureau and the Tanabe Tourism Association, has been developing Aikido tourism itineraries this year. And this project is one of the Japan sports agencies, sports tourism development project in 2022. And I have been serving for the Japan Sports Agency project as a committee member for the last 2 years. And actually this Thursday, the day after tomorrow, I will attend their trial package tour, Aikido tourism itineraries on the way home to Nagoya. And anyway, developing Aikido tourism itinerary itself is very interesting. That this group also look at the compatibility of Aikido and Kumano Kodo because they shared the Japanese cultural aspect in Aikido and Kumano Kodo. So I would like to introduce next Kumano Kodo because that's very important outdoor sports tourism attraction in Wakayama Prefecture. So probably most of you know Kumano Kodo, which is the World Heritage Pilgrimage Route, and they are listed under sacred site and pilgrimage route in the key mountain range. And as mentioned in the previous slide, it is assumed that there's a high compatibility of Kumano Kodo and Aikido in terms of Japanese culture. In other words, people who walk on Kumano Kodo may be interested in Aikido tourism as well, and vice versa. And and by focusing on the form of the activity, walking on Kumano Kodo is active sports tourism in which tourists engage in actual sports engagement at the destination. But as with Aikido tourism, because of the Japanese cultural emphasis, this walking on Kumano Kodo can be also considered heritage sports tourism. So walking on Kumano Kodo is a combination of active and heritage sports tourism in Wakayama Prefecture. And this World Heritage Site has attracted outdoor sports tourists to Wakayama Prefecture a lot. So, but what can we do for the next step? I believe that examining unique experiences while walking on Kumano Kodo is necessary for a further promotion of this outdoor sports tourism destination. And in particular, it should take advantage of the history and the culture of Kumano Kodo. And please look at these two pictures. How do you feel by by looking at these two pictures of Kumano Kodo? You might feel, oh, wow, great. And that's the psychological experience, my current research topic, which is awe-inspiring experience. So walking on the World Heritage Pilgrimage route likely provide people with not only general positive effect, like having fun, but also awe-inspiring experiences. So these experiences have been examined in tourism contexts, including dark tourism, nature-based tourism, and pilgrimage tourism. By conducting an open-ended questionnaire survey, my colleague, Dr. Kono from University of Alberta, and I also identified awe-inspiring experiences among Kumano Kodo walkers. However, our samples worked with a kataribe, who is a guide or storyteller, explained significant roles of environment and culture and tradition history of Kumano Kodo. So therefore, such information might have promoted their own inspiring experiences. So to test this possibility, we have been conducting a series of studies, study 1 and study 2. So I'm going to share our research, ongoing our research today. So for study 1, we just finished collecting data, and we will present our findings at the Canadian Congress on Leisure Research next year if our abstract is accepted. So fingers crossed. So in study 1, participants, we recruited 51 undergrad students, and they participated in this experimental study. So after giving consent, participants completed the questionnaire before and after watching a 2 minutes VR video walking on Kumano Kodo. And this is like my office, and these two participants are watching the video by using these VR goggles. And the key point of this study was participants were randomly assigned either treatment or control groups. So in the participants in the treatment group, before watching the VR video, they were informed that the VR video was recorded on Kumano Kodo, and they were asked to review the Kumano Kodo brochure that Wakayama Prefecture published for tourism promotion. In contrast, participants in control group, before watching the VR video, we didn't explain anything about Kumano Kodo or about the VR video was recorded on Kumano Kodo. So they didn't know, oh, this is just like a hiking VR video. So we are going to compare all inspiring experiences between these two groups. So for study 2, we are going to conduct next year, and hopefully we can get some help from the Center of Tourism Research for participant recruitment. So a participant will walk on Kumano Kodo from Takijiri to Takahara for about 150 minutes and complete a couple of questionnaires on the trip. And again, the participants will be randomly assigned to 2 groups, treatment or control groups. So participants in the treatment group will walk with a kataribe, and before walking, they will also stop by the Kumano Kodokan Pilgrimage Center, where they can learn history and the culture of Kumano Kodo. In contrast, people in the control group will walk without kataribe, or before walking, they will not stop by Kumano Kodokan, the center. And we will going to compare these two groups in terms of awe-inspiring experiences. And then I'd like to show you next YouTube video about outdoor sports tourism in Japan. I believe that is humankind as good sensing introduced. So as the video showed the phrase nature is awesome, I agree it is true, but I also believe the history and the culture of Kumano Kodo are awesome. So we hope that our two studies will reveal unique experiences, namely awe-inspiring experiences while working on Kumano Kodo, and significant roles of Kataribe in such experience for rural tourism development. And lastly, I'd like to introduce another important outdoor sports tourism destination in Wakayama, that is Shirahama. So Shirahama is here. And again, we are Wakayama city and around here, I think. And as you see the picture, there's a very beautiful beach and lots of people go there during summer. And this beach is the sister to Hawaii's Waikiki beach. And surprisingly, the sand has been imported from Perth, Australia, where Michael lives. And probably Michael has brought some sand for the beach today, this time. So, And when I'd like to introduce, what I'd like to introduce today regarding outdoor sports tourism development is that Shirahama has strategically addressed tourism seasonality. So research on seasonality and sports tourism development is very limited, but what we know is both tourism and sports are characterized by seasonable variations. For example, we go to beach in summer and we go skiing in winter. And in a tourism context, these variations are generally seen as undesirable because like hotel managers would like to keep their hotels full throughout the year. And this, in this part, rural tourism development perspectives become important because tourism seasonality tends to be more exaggerated in rural areas than urban areas. And according to Heim and Hinch, one of the ways to address this issue is to introduce sport events during the off-peak period. So I have summarized the seasonal variations in terms of number of tourists in Shirahama from 2009 to 2021 and added information of sports events hosted in Shirahama. So this is the figure of 2009. And from January to December, and the green line indicates the number of tourists, and yellow line indicates number of excursionists, day trippers. And these three boxes, the blue boxes, indicate a domestic sport event. And the red box indicates the international sport event. So beach football Shirahama, Ocean Surf Challenge, and International Life Saving Cup, those three used the spectacular beach in Shirahama. On the other hand, this one is Hikigawa Riverside Marathon. So that's just a marathon event. So it didn't use the beach. And as you see, the peak in Shirahama is August and July. So this is the summer holiday in Japan. And before the peak season, like in June and after October, August, Shirahama strategically has hosted these sports events to attract more sports tourists. So this similar trend can be found the following years. So in 2010, sorry, I don't have much time, so I gotta go quick. And in 2011, Ocean Surf Challenge was moved to June from September, right before peak season. In 2012, a new domestic event, National Beach Football Cup, was hosted right after the peak season. In 2013, Beach Football Shirahama was not held. Instead, Beach Rugby Shirahama was hosted this year. In 2014, Ocean Surf Challenge was moved to September from June, and the new event, Nanki Shirahama Triathlon, started from this year. And in 2015, Nanki Shirahama Triathlon and the Beach Rugby Shirahama were hosted in the same month, right before the peak season. And next year, an interesting international event, Red Bull Cliff Diving, was hosted. It sounds like dangerous, isn't it, in the pictures? In 2017, I don't know why, but Ocean Surf Challenge was not held this year, but it was back in 2018, and there are 4 domestic sports events in Shirahama, and these seem to like regular sports event in Shirahama. And in 2019, an international event, Asia Oceania Beach Ultimate Championship was hosted. And our student, I went to the event and conducted a questionnaire survey at the event. It's a nice memory. And in 2020, there are no events due to the pandemic at all. And then next year, in 2021, one domestic sports event, All Japan Beach Ultimate Championship, was back. And I didn't summarize yet, but in 2022, this year, most of the sports events were back except for Nanki Shirahama Triathlon. So I hope that triathlon event will be back next year. And promoting the sports event seems a good strategy to overcome such seasonal variations in Shirahama, but this is just descriptive information. So more research is needed to examine the effect of this strategy for rural tourism development. So as a conclusion of this presentation, sports and rural tourism seem to have a close relationship. And from my experiences of living and conducting research in Wakayama Prefecture, this relationship is particularly substantial in Wakayama. For example, Budo tourism development in Tanabe City and outdoor sports tourism development in Kumano-Kodo and Shirahama. And even more sports tourism attractions exist in Wakayama, including cycling, as Funck sensei introduced, and that's also popular attraction in Wakayama Prefecture. And also there's a very interesting outdoor sports activity, rafting. So if you hear the rafting, you may imagine like this picture, the top right corner. But in Wakayama Prefecture, you can experience a Japanese authentic rafting called Ikada Kudari at Kitayamamura in Wakayama Prefecture. And this is the actually us, like the CTR team, Nakamoto-san, Kobayashi-san, and Murano-san. So we experienced Ikada Kudari together. And Joseph was not here because he was stuck in Australia due to the COVID pandemic. Maybe you should go there before you, maybe this year. So So I'd like to conclude my presentation by using Dr. Chia's comment from the abstract of the symposium. So I would say with sports tourism development, rural tourism in Wakayama can be positioned for greater resilience for the in times of rapid change and persistent uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ito, for your presentation. And it raises a very interesting conversation for us, because often when we talk about tourism in Japan, we talk about culture, heritage, and nature-based tourism. But very often sport tourism gets forgotten. Of course, we hosted the Olympics here in 2021, not 2020. So I think Eiji shines the light on an area that has great potential for tourism in Japan. So thank you again, Dr. Ito, for your presentation. Our next speaker comes from Hokkaido, and her research, so we've gone from the Setoichi area that Professor Funck talked about to Hiroshima and Wakayama that Dr. Ito talked about, and now we will go to a number of places, I think. Our next speaker is Susanne Klien from Hokkaido University in the northern parts of Japan. Anxious tourism, emerging forms of tourism in times of creative depopulation. Welcome, Susanne, over to you.
Thank you. It's really great to be back. Like Professor Funck, my last time was the Critical Tourism Conference. So right at the start of the pandemic. It's great to be back and see everyone and be back into Wakayama. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about anxious tourism, which may be a little bit of a paradoxical term, and emerging forms of tourism in times of creative depopulation. The term creative depopulation assumes that depopulation is not necessarily a negative thing, but it can actually be good to have less people and have kind of a new approach to a reality that we have to face, not only in Japan, but elsewhere as well. So I would like to start with the notion of rural areas as sites of experimentation, quite in contrast to the general idea that rural areas are stagnant, they're full of elderly senior citizens, and that they actually don't have much of a future. So I've written about this in my book, Urban Migrants in Rural Japan, and there have been an increase of people moving from cities to rural areas, looking for a better life, looking for a more sustainable life. And with the pandemic, also a more resilient life in terms of having better access to food, having more air and more space, for example. So I think now is a really good timing to think about the future of travel, given that lifestyles and modes of traveling have changed quite a lot in Japan, but also in other countries. And rural areas have a lot of strengths that we actually need to perhaps reflect on. So there's a couple of reasons why it makes sense for us to explore rural areas as sites for tourism and travel. First of all, the big factors, of course, that rural areas have faced depopulation and aging for quite a while. Hoshilja Chang has written about Japan as a living laboratory of rural shrinkage. So saying that actually it's useful to see, to have this knowledge on how Japan has experienced and reacted to rural shrinkage as a harbinger of a depopulating and aging society. It will be a valuable asset to other countries that will face the same issues sooner or later. Second, the pandemic has reorganized the urban-rural divide in significant ways. Ways how people work have changed quite a lot. There's more remote work. And so just this picture of a field site in Tokushima could actually be out of Tokyo. There's not so much of a difference looking at the kind of way people work. no matter whether they're in rural areas or whether they're in cities. And I'd like to perhaps coin the term urban rural to kind of think about the increasing fusion of elements of the city and the countryside. So I think we've already seen this. This kind of also relates to gentrification, to what Dr. Funck brought up, things that kind of may be positive and negative at the same time, really. Just to give an example, coffee culture, having all of a sudden pretty hip and good espresso access in rural areas may be seen by some researchers like me, but they also do have downsides because they kind of bring in city culture that you may find everywhere. So I think it might be good to actually discuss this in further detail later. There have also been terms like vacation and leisure in Japan, the combination of work and vacation, as on the left picture. This is from Kamiyama town, which I'm going to discuss later. And the homepage over there is from the Japan Vacation Association, which tries to introduce more understanding of how to combine work and leisure in the countryside and also kind of make a contribution to revitalization in the process. Business and leisure combined into one. So there has been quite a lot of change and people have become more flexible. Also, there has actually been quite a change at the institutional level because the government, the Kishida government in late 2021 introduced the Digital Garden City National Plan, which actually also tries to provide closer links between urban and rural areas through the means of digitalization. So trying to aim for improving people's lives, people who live in remote areas in the countryside, and try to improve their well-being through various technical means. So there have been catchphrases like disaster resilience, smart healthcare, and smart homes and the like. So there has been a big change at the institutional level. Also, if we look at statistics, it's quite clear that 2020 was a turning point. Actually, May of 2020, you can see that more people started to leave Tokyo rather than move to Tokyo. So clearly remote work has made a huge difference, but also the pandemic seems to have encouraged people to think about what they want to do now rather than kind of postpone rural life to a later stage after they retire. Another thing that it might be worth mentioning is that there has been a recent move, this is until between 2020 and 2021, there has been increasing moves to adjacent areas close to Tokyo. So it seems that people want to have easy access to Tokyo when they need to go there for work, but they also can enjoy nature and have closer access. So clearly a paradigm shift has happened, and I think this is a huge chance for rural areas to think about new target groups, including tourism. Third, another reason why we need to think about rural areas, in my opinion, is that planetary changes resulting in global warming have pushed us to think more about the Anthropocene. This is actually a picture from this weekend. Sorry. And oh no, I want to go back. So this is actually from Hokkaido. On the left side, just going into the forest, you can see all kinds of cars being disposed of. So we do have environmentally friendly practices, but we also have a lot of dumping of old cars. And so rural tourism really offers a chance to think about how we can make a difference, something we've already heard in previous presentations. And one thing I'd like to also point out that there has been a huge renewed interest in rural areas as sites of revitalization. But at the same time, the notion of rural tourism has actually often not been clearly defined. So drawing on John Knight, I would like to look at the case of Kamiyama town in Tokushima prefecture and taking kind of this idea that tourism is not a unified fixed category, but rather the dynamic object of a multifaceted local as well as non-local debate. So tourism as something that keeps being redefined by the people who are planning it. So I would like to take a look at Kamiyama town. This is in Tokushima, just across the sea in the south. And I'm drawing on follow-up fieldwork last year in April and May and participant observation. So that was face-to-face fieldwork during the pandemic. Just a few words about the place. So Kamiyama town is known as a place that has attracted lifestyle migrants. So people who move there, digital nomads, entrepreneurs. And it is not primarily known as a tourist place, but it is located across the traditional pilgrimage route called Ohendo in Shikoku. So the residents are quite welcoming towards strangers. There is a Osetai culture. It's a culture of hospitality, of welcoming, and they're quite friendly towards newcomers, because that's been the history of the town. The town is also very mountainous. More than 80% of the area is covered in mountains and forests. So forestry has been a huge industry. And it also has quite a high rate of senior citizens, more than 40%. It's actually, it is remotely located, but at the same time, it's only 1 hour drive to Tokushima Awaodori Airport. So, and only 2 hours to Osaka. So it's actually quite convenient. I think that Kamiyama is a great place to rethink emerging forms of tourism, because there have been lots of visitors, even during the pandemic. So this is a picture of a short-term visitor from Osaka, whom I'm gonna talk about in a minute. People who just come for a short term, and they are actually hoping to experience the rural life by working in the field with local residents together. So this could also be seen as a form of regenerative tourism, trying to make a positive impact while also getting a sense of the life in that place, a sense of the community. And I think this is a huge chance for proximity tourism. People who just make a relatively short trip from relatively close areas, but also people who might be flexible and decide on the spot that they actually want to stay longer. So quite a few tourist agencies have tried to adapt to this new form of making a trip rather than totally planned. Especially younger people would just kind of decide on the spot what they want to do. So I would like to introduce the notion of anxious tourism today. I've already touched on it briefly before. It draws on the idea that people who are a little bit on the lookout for new forms of living make a trip to rural areas to see how, whether they could actually live there in the long term. So it is a kind of hybridization of tourism, lifestyle, and kind of experience something new. So I also draw on moratorium migration. This is a term I introduced in my book also. And it is defined as a mechanism to which individuals in different life stages resort to in order to hedge their bets, gain time, and seek assurance, inspiration, and courage to do, or to further postpone doing what they ultimately feel makes sense to them. So this concept fuses the previously contradictory elements of lifestyle and precariat into a fuzzy gray zone, where work, lifestyle, leisure, self-realization, precarism is all blended into one. So we actually think that mobility often comes in with great ambitions, with plans, something that is in the lifestyle migration concept that was defined by Michaela Benson and Karen O'Reilly. And this is obviously a very compelling concept, but I think we also need to keep in mind that quite a few people are not totally sure what they actually want to do. And so I think Angela McRobbie and her concept of mobility, which doesn't quite know where it's going, should also be kind of kept in mind, especially now with the pandemic and increasing financial instability. So kind of experience something new. So I also draw on moratorium migration. This is a term I introduced in my book also. And it is defined as a mechanism to which individuals in different life stages resort to in order to hedge their bets, gain time, and seek assurance, inspiration, and courage to do, or to further postpone doing what they ultimately feel makes sense to them. So this concept fuses the previously contradictory elements of lifestyle and precariat into a fuzzy gray zone where work, lifestyle, leisure, self-realization, precarism is all blended into one. So we actually think that mobility often comes in with great ambitions, with plans, something that is in the lifestyle migration concept that was defined by Michaela Benson and Karen O'Reilly. And this is obviously a very compelling concept, but I think we also need to keep in mind that quite a few people are not totally sure what they actually want to do. And so I think Angela McRobbie and her concept of mobility, which doesn't quite know where it's going, should also be kind of kept in mind, especially now with the pandemic and increasing financial instability. So I would like to combine this anxious tourism concept with the idea of the Kanke Jinko, which translates into related population. This is a term that was coined by a journalist, Tanaka Terumi, around 2019. It has been taken up by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Tourism. This is a graph from 2019. And you can actually see that the Kanke Jinko, the related population, is in between the permanent population, the Tejo Jinko, and the Koryo Jinko, or the exchange population, which would be tourists, classical tourists. So the related populations are people like researchers, like artists in residence, people who are students, or people who have some kind of stake in the community and do not live in the community, but they come back time and again and engage relatively deeply with the community. And according to the estimations of the ministry, the MLIT, there's about 10 million such people across Japan. So it is a huge group of people that that is really important to kind of think of as a potential target group. I'm saying so because these people are thinking about experiencing place. So experience is the key word. They're looking at experiences. They're also trying to present these experiences on social media. So it's all about Instagram, about Twitter, and it's about having a new experience. They're hoarding experience in a way. And they're not so much interested in getting very much into deep relations, but they kind of are interested in getting a sense of the place. And I think this is quite an interesting chance for tourism and creating new tourist groups. So Kamiyama has not been known as a genuine tourist place per se, but just to kind of explain about why I think there's a lot of hybridization going on between lifestyle migrants, tourists, and short-term visitors. I'd like to present very briefly these two people here. So first, this is Shinji on the left side. He's a digital worker who has moved to Kamiyama in early 2021. He's from Fukuoka originally, and he actually sees this as a chance. So he's saying that moving to the rural area provides him opportunities that he didn't have in his hometown. He works as an IT engineer, but actually he says this is only something he does to pay his bills. He wants to be a yoga instructor and someone who works in different places. So he's saying that having different places to work and live is really important. So he says, I think that having less staff and being able to move easily is a great merit these days. I think that career-wise, a move also means more stability as we have had more natural disasters. So clearly, this idea of a sedentary lifestyle is changing a lot now with the pandemic and also other disasters. Having several places of work and life may be actually more strategic in these times. And the second person I'd like to briefly introduce is Susanne on the right-hand side. So she's from Osaka area. She's a worker, a contract worker in Osaka. And she's thinking about a rural move, but she's not quite sure whether she can actually do this. So she's decided to come for a short-term visit to check what it's like and talk to people. And so she's a little bit torn between her wish to achieve a new life and her responsibility towards her parents, thinking that she needs to take care of her aging parents, and also kind of being a little bit doubtful about her skills. So she's saying, quote, the people who've moved to Wakayama are extremely individualistic, aren't they? If I imagine myself moving and living here, of course it's okay to live here, even if I don't have that something, but I imagine it to be hard to live here without having something unique. So I would love to open a shop here. I was really thinking that, but thinking about my own set of skills, I feel that I'm not confident in being able to survive. So I'm actually arguing that these people who are a little bit anxious, who are a little bit on the quest, offer a huge opportunity as visitors, because once they experience that rural town feeling, they usually want to come back, like Shinji, who came back twice before making the move. And Misa will probably also highly likely come back because she hasn't quite yet decided to make the move because it seems out of her comfort zone. So I think that small towns like Wakayama, who are not exclusively focused on tourism, for such town, this group of people constitutes a huge potential. And last, I'd like to briefly also talk about the guest house where I met these two people. The guest house was set up by a former Chukyo, a former regional revitalization corporation officer from the greater Tokyo area. And so this is, I'll call her Rena-san. She's saying, my way to go about things may be low risk, low return. She's saying so because she has not bought a lot of stuff. Rather, she has recycled. She has used a lot of recycled stuff, like this kind of, this kind of table here. And also talking about gentrification, there's this kind of barista here who was visiting this place. So there is a real mix between urban features and rural traditions. And also Lena is drawing on her transnational experience because she's living in South Asia for a while. So she's offering cooking classes with South Asian curries, but she also offers this kind of local beer from the same town. So it's a combination of local engagement and transnational factors that people make use of. And also there's environmentally friendly practices like guests are asked to bring their own towels rather than being provided with towels, and cooking together rather than being served. So it's a new form of hospitality, which seems to attract a lot of millennial visitors, both Japanese, but also foreigners living in Japan. And many families, young families that came to visit the guest house, they were actually cooking themselves rather than being served. So self-sufficient traveling is also seems to be gaining ground. So it's really a new style of traveling that is comes with more interest in the local communities and less consumption. So it's really moving away from consumption towards experience, I think. So just wrapping up the talk, I think that I've showed that we have multifaceted mobilities, kind of hovering between living and staying and traveling. And so there has been a clear hybridization of post-COVID-19 tourism with increasing entanglements between urban and rural features. This is why I've suggested that urban-rural. And also I'm arguing that anxious tourism is a huge potential for small towns, small rural towns, not necessarily focused entirely on tourism, because I would argue that more and more younger people will start to think about what they really want to do with their lives. We've seen this with COVID in many other countries as well, people trying to cut down on their working hours. So I'm saying that actually resilience is very much about having several pillars to rely on, both from a town point of view, but also from an individual point of view, as well as from an institutional point of view. So just last, I'd like to remind you of a special issue I have edited with my colleague Paul Hansen in Asian anthropology. This is about rural Japan as futurotopia. And I think there's many of the themes we are discussing in this workshop being presented in the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanne. That brings us to the third of the three speakers for the first section today, talking about Japan. I hope the terms urban-rural will prove to be popular, Susanne, and you'll be cited. But I also love the term the phrase from Angela McRobbie's paper, mobility that doesn't know where it's going. It sounds like me every day. And there's this idea that a style of tourism appropriate for the new normal, long-stay tourism, Wakayama as a living laboratory for what we are talking about in rural tourism. So before we get to the discussion, I'd like to ask the three researchers who presented their work earlier. We will sit at the front here and go through some of the questions that have come through. But before that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Takashi Eshita, Executive Director of Wakayama Tourism, Wakayama University International, and also a big supporter of the Center of Tourism Research. Over to you, Dr. Takashi.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this conference and delivering good, nice presentations. Thank you. My major is semiconductor physics, so I'm not familiar with tourism, but I like working on Kumanokodo. I have a lot of wow, inspiring experience. Anyway, it's most beautiful season now in Japan at Wakayama. Please enjoy this conference and Wakayama. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Takashi, and always for your ongoing support of the work we do here at the Center for Tourism Research. So, without further ado, can I invite Doctors Funck, Klien, and Ito to join us at the stage here. And with the audience online, if you have any questions, please feel free to feed them through. We have some questions already. And the audience in the room, please feel free to have your questions through to us as well. Okay. So now we're all mic'd up. We're all wearing our masks. And one of the things that we are trying to do here is also try to include the audience that are online, as well as the audience in the room. So let's get to one of the first questions, and I will go to the list of things. But firstly, before we go to the questions, to our speakers, any remarks you would like to make that tie in all three of what you've said? As you were sitting there listening to each other, nothing? No problem. That's good. That's good. Okay. So one of the first questions is rather a comment from Dr. Vicky Peel at Monash University in Australia. Vicky says, "Thank you for such a very interesting presentation." And I think she's referring to you, Professor Funck. Can you please comment further on the role of adaptive reuse, which emphasizes a sympathetic response to the heritage context of the site as part of the gentrification process? She says, "We have all seen so much unsympathetic reuse of buildings, which undermine the sustainability of destinations." Over to you, Carolin. What do you think of all of that?
Yes, of course. That's why I think we need the kind of benchmarking for these reuse of buildings that should include questions of how the reuse is seen in the local community, which is an aspect that I could not sufficiently cover. But I also think this is different depending on whether you talk about real like landmark buildings that have a high symbolic value for everybody in a community or destination, or you talk about residential buildings that are just your neighbor's house. So I think the discussion is different depending on the type of the building also. But I definitely think this needs to be included in an evaluation of reuse of buildings for lodging facilities, because not if, as I mentioned, if it becomes a building that is completely inaccessible then afterwards for the people in the community, but also for normal tourists or so, that might be necessary to get this certain group of high-paying tourists to a destination, but it should not be that the whole destination is covered in places like that. So if it's a symbolic building, iconic building, there's a wider discussion needed, I think, than if it's only a normal residential house, but still that is an important point.
Yeah, I think that distinction between symbolic buildings and everyday buildings is a big distinction. But I think Carolin also raised a very important point, because in much of the research literature and even in mainstream media, the conversation around gentrification is very often a negative one. And obviously that's understood, right? The inflation of land values, cost of living and those kinds of things. But the flip side is gentrification as a positive force, particularly in many of the towns that you all work in that are deteriorating, and some of the pictures you've shown are particularly important. The next question probably applies to everybody, I suspect, from a very good friend of the Center for Tourism Research, David Nguyen, who is based at Tohoku University. David asks the question, on the subject of rural tourism, do you consider the terms rural tourism and peripheral tourism, and finally heritage tourism, to be interchangeable? So David is raising three terms: rural tourism, peripheral tourism, and heritage tourism, and whether they are interchangeable.
No, that's kind of a big question. But I think for me, from my own kind of argument of fusing urban rural, I'm not very comfortable about the term peripheral tourism, because I feel that this already kind of makes a value statement about the location of places. And in my perspective, I do not see rural areas as peripheries, as I've seen many times before. So I would actually say that these three terms are totally different. They are focusing on the different aspects, and they also include value judgments that we need to be very careful about making. There has been a huge stream of literature recently in anthropology and adjacent to Klien that actually try to rethink this understanding of rural areas versus urban areas. So I would like to use this opportunity to revamp this kind of dynamic, hegemonic dynamic that we have behind this.
And the term that Susanne raised about urban rural, you know, the blurring of the lines, right? In Japan, you know, for example, a city like Osaka melts into Kobe and they become almost the one place, right? Whereas in Australia, it's more distinct because of the large land mass. You know when you're in the outback, so to speak. Okay.
Yeah, it's also, I would not include the heritage tourism and rural tourism, because saying rural tourism is heritage tourism means rural is something of the past, which it is not. We still need people to, or we still need land and people to produce our food. And that will be rural areas partly, unless we start growing everything in glass houses and high-rise buildings also. But rural is not heritage. It's something that needs to be very much present. So that too should not be put together, I think.
Rural as a living thing rather than a relic, you know, that we look at like going to a museum. So we have a question from Professor Kia Reeves in the audience, who will be speaking later today. Over to you, Kia.
I'm not sure how much you're going to like my paper, Carolin, but my question is for Susanne in the first instance and perhaps for the whole panel. Susanne, I was very interested by that term you're using, that rural, urban, or urban, rural. I think I would hit your demographic pretty much spot on. But can I ask you to perhaps expand that out away from the case study that you're doing, which is fascinating, to maybe a broader comment, maybe a transnational and international one, and likewise for our other presenters. I found what you're talking about with sport and culture really runs through a lot of what's happening where I'm from, where we have a medium-sized sporting event, the Commonwealth Games coming, nothing like the Olympics you had, yet we have a regional area that's quite definable in Victoria, southeastern Australia, and it draws a lot on its heritage. And your overview, I'd be interested if that could be related to a broader context. But in the first instance, my question is for you, Susanne.
Thanks. I'm actually very much looking forward to your talk. I think you're going to talk about transnational elements, right? So one reason why I came up with this term urban rural is also that a lot of people who move from cities to rural areas have an experience of living overseas. So it's also kind of breaking up the focus on a nation, focus on Japan as a site. What is happening in many rural communities is that they actually are drawing on a lot of transnational elements in their daily lives. And they are kind of coming up with new cosmopolitan takes on the countryside, a notion that has also been argued by John Chukyo, anthropologist in the US. So this idea of cosmopolitan countryside, rather than countryside as a relic of the past, is really has been gaining ground and has also been even more so enforced during the pandemic, because a lot of foreigners living in Japan could not travel overseas as they usually do, and they would travel to rural areas. So cosmopolitan elements coming from various sites and influencing cultural takes, culinary takes, leisure takes. So there has been in Wakayama a new craft beer brand being actually suggested and implemented by a foreigner who has moved to Wakayama. There has been someone from Silicon Valley who has moved in. So there's not only Japanese migrants, but also quite a lot of overseas migrants engaging in entrepreneurial activities. So I would say there's really a comprehensive rethinking of values and pursuits of leisure.
Thank you, Susanne. Go ahead, Carol.
As you were pointing out before, in Japan also, it's very difficult to distinguish between urban and rural because of the way urban planning is done. So just by the physical appearance too, we have a kind of continuity between urban and rural. And the urban-rural continuum has been something that has been discussed in geography a long time. But I think the international aspect is important, not only in Japan, but also, for example, in Germany, we had in the migration wave, we had people distributed to every village. In Japan, many of the rural areas now need migrant workers to work in fisheries and agriculture. So the rural and national is no longer identical. I think it's an important point.
Thank you, Carolin. It's an important point. Go ahead, Chukyo.
So as Susanne talk about rethinking of values, that's very important for sports tourism as well, especially like sporting event. Last weekend, I attended like event management conference in Japan, and there's a keynote speaker who is from the background of architecture and community development. And his presentation was very interesting. And to develop the community or town or the city, it is very important to take care to take into account of historical and cultural background of the city. So even like the harbor city, like Kobe and Yokohama, they have different background and their history of the development city different. So for the having a sporting event, Japan is not doing really doing great in terms of the part. Like, okay, so marathon event is very popular. Let's host the marathon event our town to attract more tourists. And now there are many marathon events like every weekend in this season. And then, but it's not really meaningful to local residents or like participants. So we really need to think about what this event mean to like people. And do we really need to keep this event running? Or I think it's time to rethink like about the value of a sports event in Japan.
Thank you, Eiji. That's a really important point. To what extent does the local voice determine what goes on? Yeah. But for those who are not in Japan and not familiar with the Japan context, an important, I guess, wider social context is the fact that in Japan, there's an very much aging population, and the urban to rural drift is, I think, probably more extreme than in Australia. Although Australia's population is also densely located along the east coast more so, and Western Australia, Michael. Yeah. And the issues of rural in Japan also might be different. In Australia, outback is considered deep rural, but in Japan, where you work on small islands in the mountains, that may not be so far away from the city, but is still considered rural in that context. So there's some distinctive elements there. So the next question comes from Januszka Schmidt from Groningen University in the Netherlands, but also a visiting researcher here at the Center for Tourism Research in Wakayama. Januszka says, I have two connected questions for Ito Sensei. I was wondering if you can already say a bit more about your research about awe-inspiring experiences. In particular, can you already see whether movement is an integral part of the awe-inspiring experience? Second part of the question, Eiji. Is there something inherent to the spatial settings that inspire awe, independent from whatever activities or knowledges of the person visiting? I can repeat them. What's the first one? Is about awe-inspiring experiences and whether movement is an integral part of awe-inspiring experiences.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The awe-inspiring experience it's actually it's also the first one and second question connected to my answer, but so sometimes like the one of the important aspects which inspire awe is like a vastness, like, oh, this is really great, like a mountain is huge, or the landscape is very spectacular, for example, Grand Canyon, or that's really great. That's like inspire awe experiences. But when I was doing research with my colleague in terms of Kumano Kodo, we also realized that not just for the landscape, but also the history aspect. Like, for example, I explained the participant, like 1,000 years ago, people walked on this trail, like taking many days to go to the shrine in which locates in Wakayama Prefecture and from like Kyoto or Osaka. And that means something, and like, for example, like the some like stones or like a shrine on the trail, like a little temple or those stuff. And like, so for my research VR video, I didn't actually include such like spectacular view because we know that that's like inspire awe experience, but we would like to focus on like looks like just regular hiking trail, but it is not. It used to be used for pilgrimage, like still. So that's the component we'd like to examine, like the information is actually important or not, like people knowing the history or background of culture, and maybe that makes psychological experience differently among workers, tourists. So I wonder if I just directly answer the questions, but and for the VR study, we already actually analyzed the data, and we didn't find any significant differences between the two groups. And now we are discussing like why it didn't happen. Maybe the VR video is short, just 2 minutes, and also maybe the Wakayama Prefecture Akumanoko, the brochure was not enough. So next time we are going to take the participants to actually on-site, and then we're gonna make them, we ask them to walk on Kumanoko Kodo Trail with Kataribe or without Kataribe, like a guide, and we will see, like we will make sure what actually inspire or expense. Maybe not, maybe, but it does. So that's our ongoing research projects.
Thank you, Eiji. Thank you, Anushka, for your question.
Oh, she was there.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for the question.
Another question that I would like to raise is it relates to the work that Kazu Nakamoto-san and I have been doing in Wakayama Prefecture, examining the role of young entrepreneurs, because when we speak of aging, clearly we can rebalance the aging if more young people move to rural areas, right? What do you think are the critical kind of issues around young entrepreneurs, not only being attracted to rural areas, as you alluded to, Carolin and Susanne, but also keeping them there, right? Let's call it a fantasy of rural lifestyle becomes a reality when you've been there for a few months. So for young entrepreneurs in particular, who seem to be the drivers of change and entrepreneurship, what do you think are the critical factors that might keep them there?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So I think most of them would move there first because there's some kind of funding available. So it's quite, I guess you could say, it's kind of easy to lure them in the first place by providing financial incentives. But the critical thing is what happens to them afterwards, after the funding expires. So some people have actually pointed out that there is a lack of caring by city representatives, by town representatives towards entrepreneurial individuals. So, for example, providing information, providing access to networks with different entrepreneurs, linking up entrepreneurs in the place and a kind of as an official measure. I think it usually comes back to personal connections, personal networks that emerge, but not kind of a systematic network by the town. So I think this would be one step. Another would be really kind of more systematic access to facilities, infrastructure, like many rural towns now provide incentives for young families by offering, for example, free healthcare for children or free access to education. So this is already happening in some rural towns, but not so much for entrepreneurs, like, for example, providing collective office space for free could be one thing. Providing high fiber internet for free, stuff that is relatively cheap to actually provide, I think. But still, it's not happening so much. So I guess it's really about technical equipment, information, and networks.
Definitely digital connectivity.
Yeah,
that's
so what the digital garden plan was also envisaging in a way,
Yes.
using digital means to link people together across base.
Well, that takes out the problem of the distance a little bit because
Yes.
people can connect much easier with their customers, for example. So many of the entrepreneurs do a business where they make products out of agricultural products and sell them in urban areas, which is now possible through the internet connections. But I think also the universities are starting to do more of this entrepreneurship training now. Like we have programs for courses about rural entrepreneurs where students go to rural areas and talk to people who do their business there. So starting from the education is an important issue, I think.
Okay, we have some comments and questions from the audience here. While we get the microphones to them, I wonder if I could raise a related question to that to the panelists. So we talked about individual entrepreneurs, and Carolin mentioned the process whereby some big companies are entering depleted rural areas and basically dominating the entire town and siphoning or sucking all of the tourism benefit into themselves at the detriment of everybody else. Is that a phenomenon you think is in terms of building resilience? Does that build resilience, or does it build more dependence or isolation and exclusion of local people?
Well, from the example I mentioned, that particular company in Setsuda is really trying to attract more businesses, new businesses. So they are trying to spread out. And I think that is very important. If you have just one company coming in that dominates, that will get you back to the old structures of the hot spring towns or so, where you had this one dominant, the main hotel dominating the whole area. So it really depends on the policy of the company, I think. And that needs, of course, to be that needs to be negotiated before they come, but that happens very rarely.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with Professor Funck. I would maybe add that the town could kind of take measures to create a network to make sure that this is not happening, to kind of provide a platform for diversification. But I think I would be a bit cautious and say that such a company entry could actually have both benefits as well as downsides, and especially in towns that haven't had so much tourism before, it could be a first step towards promoting a sense of what the town actually has on offer. So I would actually see both ways. And I would kind of add that it's important for the town or some kind of official prefectural level or municipal level, making sure that this doesn't get out of hand, perhaps.
Well, the problem is that the towns are in a position to negotiate those usually because they want the companies to come and they don't have the knowledge. If it's an international company, they will have so much more skills and knowledge than the local administration has. But they are really not on an even position. So you have to be lucky, like in this case, that you have a company that really sees local integration as part of their success, which is quite a good strategy.
Thank you. What Dr. Funck Sensei pointed out actually that really apply for sports tourism development too. Like some outdoor sports tourism destination and the Budo tourism destination. Like some travel agency just jumping in and then try to develop itineraries, but that's just they need a collaboration with local people. For example, for tourism, Budo tourism development, like local practitioners, local senseis, and how many facility like dojo are there, and they really need to know. And once the funding is cut and they just leave and nothing is going to left, that sometimes happens. And I don't know, I can say that here, but for the Japan Sports Agency project, like we received a bunch of proposals, funding, application, and then we committee member just reviews the proposals, but the proposals which actually the tourism agency created really good, appealing because they have experience making a good proposals, making nice pictures and easy to read, and they have resources, but if some application just local people made is they don't know how to write a proposal, so it just seeing the proposal, oh, this doesn't look good, but actually there may be really a hidden really strong attraction there, and the local people may really need help, and that's really hard to judge from reviewer perspective. That's a problem.
Yeah. Before we go to the questions, the local is an interesting concept, right? Because we assume from the outside that they want tourism, that they want an expansion of tourism. But an expansion of tourism implies change. Whether they are prepared or willing to accept the change that comes is a big thing, right? So let's go to the floor. And a question from Dr. Michael Volger from Curtin University.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. I wanted to thank all three presenters. I found all the presentations very inspiring. Ito Sensei, your work on the awe-inspiring experiences reminds me very much of my work on atmospheres, and also your experiment that you're conducting, trying to see how I would say narratives or dominant stories that are provided to those experiencing something, how they make an impact. So yeah, it's very similar to some of the research I've been trying to do. But my question relates to what Funck, Dr. Funck Sensei said. I agree that the lodging aspect is often being neglected in tourism, or how should I say, in that part of tourism research that looks at the tourism system and the regional development system. It's often more focused on attraction points, which are of course very important. But I totally agree that in order to realize bigger economic benefits, that the lodging is really crucial. But my question is, and I think you mentioned it to some degree, is this increasing diversity, but also renewal in lodging, is this driven by local entrepreneurship, or is this driven by international investment, or is this driven by out of people who originally are from these regions but went into the major urban areas and now are investing in their areas where they came from originally? And is this even important where the money comes from? So would you think this is relevant to have a look at?
Yeah, I think where the money comes from is important because it influences who gets to the decisions. Well, if you look at the rural areas in Japan, the international influx is still very slow. So international investment in tourism facilities in Japan only started around 2000. And then in the rural areas, it is still very rare. So many of the projects, because of the increase in these Airbnb type facilities and the request for renting just one house. So a lot of the facilities are really either guest house or they are like places where you rent the whole house. So they are small projects. So very often they are developed by people who move to that area. So it's the entrepreneurs who are coming from outside and it's part of their business. Sometimes there is now people who develop this as a business model. So they live in the wider area, like in a city, but they have several of these guest houses or one house rentals in different areas. So it's regional entrepreneurs. Sometimes it's local people, but it's not so many from what I have seen from the example so far. But it's starting in some areas, like in areas where tourism becomes really popular, like Yakushima, which is not Seto-Inansi. The local people also started to use their vacant houses for tourism because they saw it's a good business model. But you have to go above a certain threshold. So I think in the starting phase, it would be more people coming in from the outside doing this kind of development.
I think, Michael, related to the question, investors are, to use the economic term, they are rent seekers, right? They're not there to provide a philanthropic service. They are there because they spy an opportunity to build a business and to make a profit. And the risk premium in rural areas is much higher. So as a result, they would expect more in return. So I think they're very relevant questions. And the extent to which they lock out local participation is something that is ongoing in all of the case studies that we see. Next question comes from Dr. Anne Hardy, University of Tasmania.
Thanks, everyone. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. My question is for Dr. Klien Sensei, and it was, I suppose, also to Dr. Funck as well. But I really liked your term of the Kanke Jinko and the talking about the population who often return to sort of engage, and perhaps that they're driven by sort of anxieties. And I was wondering, it made me think of a lot of research that's going on around well-being as well, and whether you see any sort of crossover with that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. lot. Definitely well-being is absolutely, is really on the agenda for people. First in the sense that they really crave to get out from the kind of secluded atmosphere during the lockdown. I mean, there was not a lockdown in Japan, but this kind of self-imposed lockdown of not the sense that it's morally not good to move around, as we already had, kind of beyond the perfection. So kind of just working in the field a little bit, not the proper thing, like as a farmer, of course, but just to get your hands dirty a little bit.
Yeah.
Gives people the Instagram motive they're seeking for, and they also get a new mindset. It's a refreshing of the mind, I guess. So I think the mental aspect is really important. But there's also the importance of, there's an extreme pressure of trying to invent yourself as a person, which of course has been going on well before the pandemic. So well-being also turned around, like in terms of pressure and surveillance, is also something that I've been quite fascinated in. I'm trying to explore that as well.
Yeah, it seems to be a very similar thing that's playing out in Australia as well. So yeah, fascinating. Thanks. And the same with microtourism. Sorry, I'm grabbing the microphone, but just quickly, that Tamara Young, who's not here today, she's done research into microtourism, but through another lens, and that's fantastic. But thank you. Thanks.
Okay, we have another question from the floor here. One of our doctoral researchers in the Faculty of Tourism, Raphael.
Good afternoon. So my name is Raphael. I'm a PhD candidate in Wakayama University right now. So I have a question to Professor Carolin related with the population of rural areas. I'm pretty sure, as you research a lot about this topic, I'm pretty sure you're well aware of the term Akiya, Minka, Kominka houses that actually being function transfer into something else. Let's say they transform into accommodation services or restaurant or cafe. But my quite concern is this, like, remember that Japan is quite big in size, making transportation access and infrastructure become very costly. So I'm pretty sure like these two factors are quite crucial for tourism to grow. Then how effective is it transforming houses, old houses or abandoned houses into something like a tourism destination to counter accelerating the population and to boost rural tourism development across Japan? Thank you.
Well, it's not going to be effective everywhere. So, because you will be competing. So every village in Japan is trying to use their empty houses to make tourist facilities. So there would be an oversupply. So I think you need a certain kind of clustering. So the example you were giving from Katsuyama, it's a place that has become so popular with immigrants. More and more people go there. And with other places too, you will have to get a certain amount of facilities connecting to each other to be successful. And of course, access will always be a problem, but even international tourists now more and more switch to cars, rental cars. So the very rural areas have become actually quite accessible, with the road construction being very popular in Japan. So access is becoming maybe less of a problem, but rather than how to network the facilities with close by attractions, as you mentioned, and so on. And the surroundings, the attractiveness of the surroundings, of the landscape, and so on is important. So not everything will be successful.
And also connect to that, while we are talking about benchmarking, if we compare Australia to Japan, Japan's public transport infrastructure is far superior to what we have in Australia, being able to connect areas. Then not to mention the distances between urban and rural. And in Australia, urban and rural is quite some way away. Okay, we have another question here. I will scroll down to it. The question of planning regimes, and it seems to me that planning is a particularly important part of the direction that's undertaken, but planning as well as the lack of planning. In your experience in the areas in which you are working, is there effective planning, or is this dominated by happenstance or where the money comes from?
Well, I don't know. Well, I suppose we would say lack of planning.
Yes, I think we agree on that, right?
Yes.
Especially at the official level, the municipal level, I think the common kind of trend would be that very few towns would have a concrete plan, how they, something like a policy paper where they kind of reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of the place and decide on how they want to envisage a tourism policy. I have not seen this from my own experience, but it may be limited because I'm not focused exclusively on tourism studies.
Yes.
Maybe Carolin.
Well, municipalities have to make a plan, a tourism plan, but usually it consists of the number of tourists they want to get and how much money they should spend. And what they do is just use the national plan and calculate the numbers based on their population.
Yeah.
So then recently the national plans also includes like increase in repeat visitors and spread to more peripheral or rural areas.
Yeah.
So that might be included, but there, as you mentioned, there is no plan saying, okay, this is the type of tourism that we want.
Yes.
Basically, the idea is what can we do to get to this number?
Yeah.
That's the main thing that's included.
And also
in
it's
tourism
mostly
plans.
focused on consumption and economic growth.
Yeah.
So how can we get people to visit and spend money, regardless of the environmental impacts, regardless of any other impact? And I think this is changing now. So looking at the policy papers at prefectural level, in my case, the prefectural level was actually much more progressive than the municipal level.
Yeah.
So Tokushima Prefecture has not been very well known as a place, even in Japan, I think. It has not been known at all as a tourist visit this place, destination. But they are talking about long stay tourism now. So clearly, a lot of places are taking this as an opportunity to revamp their non-existent or close to non-existent tourist policy. And then this kind of prefectural level kind of impacts the municipal level. So the municipal level, they have been talking about the need for thinking about it. And often, of course, there's the kind of company level. There's some kind of company in town which impacts how people think. So I think it's a number of factors coming together.
Okay, it touches on the question that's asked by Eiji Wijaya about supply and demand and matching the two, right? Because in tourism, one of the things we know is that often demand is stimulated from outside the destination, and they have no control of it. I mean, we look at Kyoto as an example. You know, before the pandemic, talk of tourist pollution or Funck was very popular, and now we see Kyoto speaking once again about quickly recovering from tourism because the city appears to be on the brink of bankruptcy, or if not past that, right? And this kind of passive participation where everything is driven from outside, but the impacts are felt locally is something that is quite, prominent in rural tourism, because when local people bear the cost of tourism, but don't share in the benefits, that's when we have problems, right? And that's the challenge for rural tourism. Okay. Do we have any further questions or comments from the room? Kazuo Nakamoto?
Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed all of your presentation. Thank you very much. So I have one quick question to probably all of you. So Dr. Chia just mentioned about local community, and when it comes to tourism and the migrants and lodging and sports events, local community is always heavily involved. And it's not necessarily always there, events on the migrants and lodging. It's not always welcoming for local community. And so I would like to know
what would be the key factors to be successful for the events, for example?
Money as a tourist consultant.
Yeah, so yeah, that's my question.
That's very difficult. I knew that.
It's related to the last discussion about the benchmarkings, and I have been serving for the sports promotion plans like in Osaka Prefecture and Aichi Prefecture. And my municipality is always looking for good benchmarkings, like Funck sensei and Susanne sensei mentioned. But when we propose, like, how about these benchmarkings? But like they said, oh, it's too difficult to collect the data. Like they always rely on like kind of secondary data. So okay, so Japan Sports Agency collecting data, so we can use the data for our benchmarkings. So one time I suggested, why don't you just try to collect the data by yourself, and then what you can try to get what you want, but the lack of resources like money and human resources, and it's hard to analyze the data too, and that's like a problem. And what I was going to say one more. Yes, I just stopped.
I think it's a big problem that we really don't know enough what's going on a local level. So I'm very much looking also forward to Anna's talk about this afternoon about how to measure tourists or how to trace tourists, because that is something that technologies are not used efficiently yet. We do get more data from the mobile phone carriers, but they are, of course, data that are sold for a lot of money. So municipalities don't get those data so easily. So I think finding out what's really going on would be quite a good first step to go on towards more successful developments.
But also the question of data relates to what you said earlier, Funck sensei, about resilience and the lack of clear goals. You know, we can talk about resilience in very soft and fuzzy terms, but at some point we have to start measuring it. And what are the indicators that are appropriate to this? And will they be applicable in different places, right? And most of the indicators we know tend to be economic indicators and indicators related to visitor numbers. Well, what about the other things like well-being and satisfaction and other things like that? What are the relevant and appropriate indicators for that?
Yeah, I would actually like to add, of course, economic factors are very important. If the tourists, the influx of tourists is not seen as a long-term beneficial thing by the community, I don't think it's going to be a long-term thing. But on top of that, and I think the pandemic has shown this, we need to revisit this idea that it's all about consumption, everything in tourism about consumption. I think consumption often has devastating impacts on the environment that people do not talk about. You touched on this in the glamping issue. And I think there should be new forms of tourist activity that go beyond consumption, focusing more on the experience and focusing more on awareness, creating awareness for the environment and also for the community. So I think maybe bringing together education and tourism, as you also mentioned, I think this could be a really good way to go, trying to create a kind of mix between tourism and education by kind of organizing workshops for students to go into communities in remote areas and try to think about what we in the university sector can contribute to the revitalization of communities, for example, from our point of view as Kanke Jinko, as the kind of related populations, people who are not necessarily in the place, but we can actually bring in our new perspectives and communicate with the locals. I think the encounters are really important, and there's been quite a lot of research showing that communities were quite skeptical about cultural activities, like, for example, the Echigo Tsumari Art Festival in Niigata is a case where there's huge opposition first by the local farmers, against this event. But now, with the increasing success, the locals have been more and more welcoming, and they see the benefits because a lot of senior citizens get a lot of stimulation by meeting people from outside. So I think the kind of cultural encounters are really, we should never underestimate that part.
Yes, yes.
Impact on the well-being of local residents, but also for visitors.
Yes. There has been ongoing discussion like quantitative against qualitative, and like usually municipality likes using numbers, like okay, the number of participants, like event participants increase like 30%, 40%, or tourism consumption like that increased a lot compared to last year. But some aspect like we can't use the for the benchmarking for the quantitative, like just number can't represent some like tourism phenomenal sports event like effect. So I think it's very important to use like both aspects, quantitative and qualitative. We can't just rely on only quantitative numbers.
And that's a promotion for qualitative researchers. From Michael Volga, Curtin University, on further to this discussion. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, a quick question for Klien Sensei. You describe a lot of very interesting phenomena, I think, but I was wondering how common they are. Are we talking about an extreme niche when you describe this phenomena? So was it difficult to find these people, or is it kind of straightforward and it's actually a common pattern?
So you're asking about the people who are looking for rural moves, but they're not quite sure where they want to go.
For example, yeah, or these temporary residents, as I would call them.
Yeah.
So is this becoming very, very common, or?
Becoming very common, and of course I also choose the place I want to go. So I choose a town where I know that there's lots of them. So I basically can just hang out in the guest house, and I can meet people every day without having to make any moves, because there's new people coming into the guest house every day, more or less. And there's also people who are staying only for 2 days, like the female visitor I introduced, but then there's also like people who are planning to come for a month, like the barista guy, and then they end up staying for 6 months. So I think this kind of unpredictable length of stay is maybe also something that we might have to take into consideration in tourism, because it will create more potential niche markets. And I think it's becoming larger because of remote work as well, because there's quite a lot of people who are free to work at their own pace. So they're not bound by physical constraints, and they can just move to a place while working. So this constitutes a huge chance, I think. So I think it's getting quite common in Japan, in other words.
Okay, I think, okay, we have one final question from the room, Januszka Schmidt.
Thank you. My question would be a follow-up question about that. If we think about power relations and who can afford these kind of trips and who can afford to do rural tourism, right? When we consider that the difference between the people who have the money and the abilities and resources to do these kind of things and the people who, well, don't and who have to live in a city because they can't afford a car, with this bridge becoming larger and larger, how can we deal with that in a way?
Yeah, thank you for a really important question. I think we have people who are quite affluent and with pretty elite backgrounds who move to rural areas. But then we also have people who have the social capital to survive in the countryside. So there's very different types. And of course, you can also buy social capital in some ways. But generally, I think there's also a lot of stories of people who are quite affluent, but still they don't manage to engage successfully in communities for various factors. So I would say, yes, there is a kind of class of migrants emerging in rural areas. And this, of course, brings up the question Dr. Funck brought up with the gentrification, because affluent people have certain lifestyles they want to hold on to, and they need to create certain shops, certain lifestyle stores, certain places they can work at. So, which kind of ends up reproducing what they left behind in the first place. So this is very difficult topic, but at the same time, it does create new opportunities for locals, and it also brings in new inspiration, I think. So, yeah, I think I would see it as a double-sided sword in a way. That should be dealt with quite carefully.
Okay, with that said, we'll wind up this morning's session. Here in Japan, it's past lunchtime, so I can hear in my stomach. And for some of you, it's afternoon tea, wherever you are. If you're in Australia, it's afternoon tea time. So don't go away. We'll be back in 1 hour with 3 speakers introducing the Australian context. But finally, thank you, Dr. Susanne Klien from Hokkaido University, Dr. Carolin from Hiroshima University, and Dr. Eiji from Chukyo University.